Welcome. Today we're joined by Eric Hacopian, a 30-year professional in American politics. We'll be discussing US President Donald Trump's recent statements and how they relate to the Nagorno-Karabakh war. Eric, thank you very much for your time.
It's a pleasure.
So US President Donald Trump had been lauding the achievement of a third ceasefire between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but that agreement, it now seems, has collapsed. Many Armenians were already wary because of the failure of the first two ceasefires, but some have been saying because it was a Washington-mediated ceasefire, that is significant in itself, and maybe there is a greater chance of it being effective. What do you think about this?
Well, it pains me to say this because I'm a U.S. citizen, but I think no one should take the United States seriously on matters like this in the world, despite the fact that it is still the richest, most powerful country in the world. It's the richest, most powerful failed state in the world at this point. So I think any U.S. mediated efforts were not going to lead to anything for countless different reasons, which we'll come back to about like what's really going to take to create a ceasefire. And it's not going to be any of these mechanisms. And the United States simply does not have the credibility or the wherewithal to either negotiate something or actually enforce it in any way. This is not I think it's very clear, and this is something that I've noticed that people in the rest of the world have not grasped to the extent that the level of dysfunctionality of American politics is not understood abroad. It's, when I say failed state, I don't kid around with that. You could have a situation in 10 days. If Biden wins the election, you could have a situation in which Trump is refusing to leave, and you could have people going after each other on the street. This is not the United States that people remember or hope for or could count on. So of these three ceasefires that have been mitigated by Russia, France, and the United States is by far the least credible party in this and the easiest to ignore.
You speak about the functionality of Washington. Do you think that this preceded the Trump administration? And furthermore, can you speak a bit on Trump's approach to foreign policy and what that means for the Nagorno-Karabakh?
I mean, listen, the United States has been in a long crisis economically, politically, in many ways. It has income distribution levels that are third worldish and a politics that's essentially entirely corrupt and dysfunctional. So I think that, and that's where Trump came from. Trump's approach to foreign policy, first of all, you have to understand, in trying to understand Trump, you have to leave all the normal political analysis aside. This is not about ideology. He is an opportunist that jumps from something to something. The two things that are consistent about him in both domestic and foreign policy is the very personal nature of it. If he likes someone, and in this case, he likes Erdogan, not because they have anything in common, but because he would like to have the powers of Erdogan, to be able to shut down Facebook and arrest your opponents and put people in jail. He has this very strong authoritarian streak. And the other one is he is very deferential to the base of people that elected him and funded his campaigns. So the hardest core of the American right wing or the Christian right wing. And remember, when that pastor was arrested in Turkey, you know, he went to war with Erdogan and crashed the lira and destroyed the Turkish economy over a couple of days and pushed them into a recession to free one Protestant pastor who was caught up in that idiot post-coup arrest scene that Erdogan was arresting everyone. So his approach is quite personal in nature, and whatever is pushed by the hard right donor base and voter base that has elected him, which is narrow and getting narrower, but he never betrays them. He will always go the extra mile for them. So you understand his motivations. There's an element of that. And I think part of the reason he might have actually been involved here is because there are certain sectors of the American religious right that actually are very much anti-Erdogan. They're not as pro-Armenian as they're anti-Erdogan. So he could have very well been responsive to that. That's the reason that they even got motivated to get engaged here. So yeah, it's to forget about normal political analysis. It's what serves his base and what is in his personal, if he likes someone, doesn't like someone. That's the nature, that's how policy is made.
And continuing on from that, presidential hopeful Joe Biden's campaign released a position paper saying that they will recognize the Armenian genocide, review security assistance to Azerbaijan, and reinstate mining aid. The US presidential election is just around the corner, and it seems both candidates are talking about Armenia far more than usual, to my knowledge anyway. Why is this?
I think this is a functionality of, this is a function of the American, there's a lot more people in America who know what an Armenian is, or what, not Armenia necessarily, but Armenians in the United States are sort of coming of age. Politically, it's not too many groups in the United States that can bring out a couple of 100,000 people out in the street. In fact, that never used to happen in the United States. Large demonstrations are a European phenomenon. So people see that. And it's also, some of those Armenian demonstrations are actually quite multiracial. Because frankly, Armenians, despite have varying different politics, the Armenians were part of the Black Lives Movement protests. So it's like, the culture of the country is changing, but Armenians are becoming far more prominent. Far more visible, I would say. It doesn't mean they're more powerful, to be honest with you. This hasn't really translated to anything. As far as his promises on genocide and recognition, all that, I wouldn't put too much credence to any of that. That's, I mean, at this point, Turkey has reached a point where you can, it's possible for that to happen, because Turkey has no friends left. They don't have any friends left in the United States. Azerbaijan is different. But Turkey, to the extent that this conflict is displayed as a conflict against Turkey, Armenia has a lot more friends, because they're quite isolated as far. All their traditional supporters in the United States have pretty much abandoned them. So I think what leads to this focus on Armenian things, it's the visibility of the community and the fact that people have been exceptionally active in places where you can't even imagine, the Alaska State House. In Colorado, they were blocking streets. So, and this new generation of, US-born, US-raised Armenians is far more articulate, let's not forget, since the last, far more affluent than 30 years ago. This is not your grandfather's Armenians. It's just a new set of people, and they've sort of picked up the vibe of militancy that's going on in the United States also.
Do you think maybe jostling for votes, does that?
I think there's an element to that, but not too much of an element for that, because the way the American political system is by states, and Armenians tend to be in states that are not particularly competitive. Most Armenians live in California, which is it's a foregone conclusion who's going to win that. So there's an element of that, because there's Armenians everywhere in certain swing states that decided the election, Michigan, especially Michigan, to a lesser extent Florida. But yes, there's an element of that. But I think politicians in general pay attention to large crowds, and to what extent you're willing to be militant about it.
So when the US National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien went on Face the Nation, he said the following, quote, "Under the President's direction, we have spent the entire weekend trying to broker peace. Armenia has accepted the ceasefire. Azerbaijan has not yet. We are pushing them to do so." Do you think perhaps that O'Brien demonstrated that it's the Azerbaijani side that's not adhering to the ceasefire? And I wanted to also ask, last time we spoke, you said that US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, there was almost a disinterest or ignorance when it came to the Caucasus. Why is there this sudden engagement?
It could be from his Christian rights supporters. And Pompeo is also very highly connected to the Christian right in the United States. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but one of the biggest, Billy Graham, whose son is a spiritual advisor to Trump, believe it or not. His brother-in-law is Armenian, who married his sister into Billy Graham's family. So Armenians have always been prominent in the evangelical movement in the United States, and we've never really done a good job of using them, to be honest with you. I think there's two things with this. At this point, outside of the idiot headline writers at the AP, everyone knows who violates the ceasefire. The side that's on the offensive and is gaining is the side that violates the ceasefire, not the side that is on the defensive and fighting for its life. So you're not fooling the Macrons and the Putins of the world about who's violating these ceasefires, especially when you announce it at 8:02 in the morning and it's posted on your Twitter page from at 10:08 last night. So they're not fooling anyone with that. But I think where the segue here is that these decisions on these ceasefires are not being made in Baku, they're being made in Ankara. At this point, despite the fact that they've bet on each other and they're winning this bet, Aliyev is a satrapy of Erdogan. So unless you separate their mutual interests from each other, you're not going to have any kind of a ceasefire, because every time there's a ceasefire that they violate, they gain from it. So why would they? And if there's no consequences for it, and we'll get to that later. But as far as O'Brien is concerned, listen. I mean, I'll just tell you two things about him. He was a mid-level lawyer in Los Angeles, whose most famous legal case involved Mattel's Barbie doll cases. He was the Mattel attorney. And during A$AP Rocky's trial in Sweden, who was a rapper who was a friend of Trump's, he was Trump's personal representative to that trial. So this notion that this character is going to be able to succeed where Lavrov and Mondrian failed is a bit ridiculous. This is not Henry Kissinger, okay? He's got no gravitas, no one takes him seriously, and he was never going to be able to pull this off. So I think what he said is irrelevant. I think going back to the more important point is, unless there's a price to be paid for violating these ceasefires, they'll continue violating the ceasefires. And that price to be paid is, he keeps complaining about the OSCE. Well, you know what? Maybe we should skip out the OSCE and there should be immediate recognition of Artsakh, because there's a mandate to protect against the genocide. I mean, if you could overplay your hand here. There's an old phrase in politics, that chicken salad can become chicken shit overnight. So at some point, there needs to be a break between Erdogan's interests and Aliyev's interests. But right now there isn't, and unless there's a price to be paid for violating these ceasefires, they have no reason to pay that price. I mean, they have no reason to stop.
Well, Eric, thank you very much for your time again.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.